Hi, everybody. I got to figure out the right distance at which to keep this from my mouth. Welcome to the Providence College Humanities Forum. You made it. Congratulations. It's great to see you all here. You didn't come here to see me. I'm going to tell you, though, what it is you're here for. I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'm going to tell you what we're doing for the next 75 minutes. And then I'm going to turn the microphone over to the person you're waiting to hear from for real. All right, so the forum is an initiative of the Humanities program. It's an opportunity for us to come together as a community at PC to do a few important things, such as exploring ideas and important questions outside of class, deepening our appreciation for the humanities, and exploring and learning from scholars with diverse perspectives and fields of expertise. So we get to discover new ideas, we get to think more deeply about the major issues in our world, society, and our faith. And these are all very good things to do. You know, if you're a professor, it's probably part of the reason why you got into the business in the first place. If you're a student, if you don't appreciate it now, what you're going to realize 5, 10, 20 years down the road is that it gets harder and harder to take time out to just explore ideas from here on out. And so you'll be thankful to your past self for having been here today. This semester we've got people speaking on everything from Greek theater, ancient Greek theater that is, to the US Constitution, to ethics and medicine in the 21st century. I'll be emailing you about them. I hope you can attend regularly. So for those of you who haven't been here before, this is the order of operations. So first of all, our speaker will speak for about 35, 45 minutes. Then we'll have a Q&A, and tradition dictates that a student has to ask the first question in the Q&A. So be on your toes. And then afterwards, we're going to do what my 9:30 does at the minute class ends, which is get up and evacuate in a stampede. Not because we want to get out in a hurry, but because there's a reception right down the hall in the Fiandella Great Room. So strike while the iron's hot. Okay, that throat clearing aside, today it's our great pleasure and honor to welcome Zena Hitz, who will be speaking to us about her recent and highly acclaimed book, Lost in Thought, The Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. Dr. Hitz is a tutor at St. John's College, and you should know that at St. John's, tutor, it really means professor or seminar leader. She's not meeting you in the library to work on your biology homework. She also went to St. John's as an undergrad before getting a master's in philosophy from Cambridge University in England and then a PhD from Princeton. And normally, with those credentials, I would start to rattle off, professorships and fellowships and so on and so forth. But part of what makes Dr. Hitz unique and part of what informs the talk that she's going to give today is how and why she turned her back on some of that academic prestige to find her vocation teaching and exploring great books in small communities, in prisons, in articles and books for general audiences, where she writes on topics such as freedom, education, happiness, faith, hope, and love. She's the founder of the Catherine Project, which takes the seminar experience of reading and discussing great books and offers them to people from all walks of life for free. And I'll close by offering two final sort of curiosities that I discovered about Dr. Hitz before handing over the microphone. First of all, she's on Twitter, and she's a frequent interlocutor of the great MC Hammer, who did his work such as Too Legit to Quit certainly informed my childhood. I don't know if it's informed yours. But there's also an extensive Wikipedia entry on Dr. Hitz in Dutch. With that, please give a warm welcome to Zena Hitz.
Oh, no, now it is. Okay. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. It's wonderful to be here at Providence College. As we were just mentioning before, I have spent some time with the Eastern Providence Dominican Friars at their home seminary in Washington. So it's a pleasure to see their Northeastern College. And they've helped me a lot, so I'm happy to help you, some of whom are future Dominicans, some of you who are current Dominicans, some of you who are just friends of Dominicans like me. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to begin by asking a question, and those of you who were at the lunch earlier today will recognize the type of question, although it's a different question. So I'd like each of you individually to ask yourself this question. So most of you are students, I'm gathering by looking at you. So why are you studying? Why did you enroll in the particular set of courses you enrolled in? Or if you've declared a major, why did you declare that major? Why does anyone go to college or graduate school in general? And why study the particular subject if there's a particular subject you settle on? Why choose that one? I'm going to guess that some of you are quite confident. I knew people like this when I was young. They're very confident either of the usefulness of your studies for some desirable project, a career, a life of work, or you may be confident of the value that that subject has for you personally. For instance, you might love what you're learning for its own sake. Others, I'm guessing, are not really quite sure why you're studying at all or why you're studying what you're studying. That seems to be pretty normal, to not be quite sure. It's very possible, very common, to go to college or to go to graduate school or to choose a major or course of study on what I call autopilot. Everyone you know does it. Everyone like us does it. Everyone expects it. It just seems normal. It's just what people do. They finish high school, they go to college. They finish college, they go to graduate school. So I'm guessing that most of you have a mix of these two kinds of motivations. That would be pretty typical. The autopilot, where you kind of just put one foot in one of the other, you do what's expected. And that sometimes results in a kind of uneasiness. Do I want this? Is this something that I want to do? And who am I anyway? You don't really develop necessarily a full self being on autopilot, even though it's often worth doing because you learn stuff that you wouldn't have learned otherwise. And so you might have a mixture of autopilot, which has those kinds of effects, or you might have a focused passion, okay? And that can also cause its own difficulties. There's a kind of anxiety. It's like, what am I sacrificing to do this? Is this the right choice? Is there something else I might learn to love more later? If I follow my passion, will I make enough money? Will I be able to support my family? Will I be able to live the kind of life that I want? So these are the kinds of, this is just in my experience, the kinds of things that most people in college or grad school experience. And if I've missed your experience, if I've misdescribed it, then please tell me that in the question period one way or the other, or email me later, or what have you. So I think it's very important for everyone to examine their own motivations for learning. And those reasons I'll explain. But certainly if you want to live an intellectual life, a life of the mind, which is something which a college might offer to you, or if you want, I'm particularly interested tonight, the type of education which at PC is found especially in your civ curriculum. It's what's called liberal education. And there's nothing, liberal education has nothing to do with being politically liberal or being classically liberal. It means that it's education for freedom. And that might also be attractive to you. You might think to yourself, yes, what I would like to be is someone who's free. I want to be someone who uses my mind well, and I want to be free in some sense or other. I want to determine my own destiny, whatever that means exactly. So I think it's important. So if you want these things, it's strictly necessary to look honestly at your own motivations, at what's making you tick. And so to provoke your thinking, to help us think about this, and I'm not patronizing you. I have to do this kind of thinking myself all the time. Those of us who are faculty members also have to do this kind of thinking. There's nothing special about young people having to do this. Self-examination is a practice for the whole of life. But to provoke your thinking, I'll bring in some examples of modes of learning that seem very unusual or even extraordinary, and then we can think about what they have to do with what any of us are doing. Okay, so there's a couple of stories here. Story 1. The Russian dissident, Irina Ratushinskaya, used poetry as a form of resistance during her imprisonment by the Soviet authorities in the early 1980s. On the transport train to the prison, Siberia's a long way away, if you're traveling in Russia, at any point of contact with other prisoners, she would recite poems, either original that she wrote or classic poems that she'd memorized. Memorized poems, the prisoners would write them out on scraps of paper and pass them between each other on the train ride. When Ratushinskaya was denied writing materials as part of her confinement, she scratched her poems onto bars of soap with matchsticks. And then she would memorize them and then wash them away, so there was no evidence of them. She would hide her poetry from her captors. And then once she'd memorized them and she had some cigarette paper, she would write out the poems on cigarette paper, and they'd be smuggled out to be published in the West. A contemporary writer named Irina Dumitrescu writes about Romanian political prisoners, this is a similar era, the Cold War era, who taught each other Morse code and tapped out poetry through the walls of their cells while they were imprisoned. Some taught each other languages when using knots on a string to code different letters. One Romanian officer in Siberia made ink out of blackberries and wrote out French poems he had memorized in school. And more than one prisoner of this era, of this time, referred to their time in prison as a university. So one might think that the pursuit of poetry or philosophy or languages in prison if we think about what they're doing this as a kind of safeguard for their dignity. Right? They're in these very difficult circumstances, totally dehumanizing, and they'd use these practices to bolster themselves, to remind themselves of their own humanity. But you might think that that's a really special kind of life of the mind, a really special kind of intellectual life. Something that's really happens only in very, very unusual circumstances. But there's actually a ton of parallel examples. So it's not as rare as we think it might be. André Weil, who was a mathematician, brother of the philosopher Simone Weil, was imprisoned in France by the Vichy government, the Nazi sympathetic government, because he refused to serve in the army. And he, while in prison, undertook a major mathematical proof. It's called the Riemann hypothesis for curves under finite fields. And he joked, writing to his relatives, that only in prison could he have done work of this quality and kind. The African-American activist Malcolm X, this is moving into 20th century, starting in between the wars, between World War I and World War II. Malcolm X entered prison as a man named Malcolm Little. He was a defiant hedonist, addicted to drugs, and practiced petty crime out of a mixture of defiance and distraction. His father had been murdered by white men when he was a child, and his family had been broken up subsequently by the local welfare office. Long studies in the prison library. So the prison library at this time is stuffed with really good books. Okay, that was the fashion of decades previous. I don't think it is anymore. So long studies in the prison library and conversations with a self-educated inmate, another inmate who was well-read and versed in this and that and could hold forth and was really interesting to talk to. So these conversations and reading changed him. So he began to read. He began with a dictionary and then books on etymology and linguistics. He studied elementary Latin and German. He converted to Islam, which is a faith that was introduced to him by his brothers. And the following years, he read the Bible, the Quran, great philosophers, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Spinoza, and Kant, as well as works of Asian philosophy. He pored over an especially loved book of the archaeological wonders of the East and West. He learned the history of colonialism, slavery, and of African peoples. He felt his old ways of thinking disappear, in his words, like snow off a roof. He left prison as a minister in the Nation of Islam and as a powerful spokesman for the African American communities most beaten down by poverty and violence that was fed by racial prejudice. So that's another very famous American example of intellectual life in prison. Examples of the flourishing of intellectual life in social isolation, relative poverty, extend far past prison walls. So consider, and some of you may recognize yourself in this, I was this way, the young bookworm who retreats from the slings and arrows of social life in elementary school, middle school, high school, and to learn or think or ponder or to imagine. You kind of retreat into the corner of your book so as not to have to interact. Or at a different level, consider the case of Albert Einstein, very famous physicist. He was unable to find an academic job. If you ever become a graduate student and are looking for an academic job, you have to remember that Albert Einstein could not get a job when he finished his degree. He was not considered smart enough. And so he had a family to support at this point. He had children, a wife, and so he needed to work. He took a job in a patent office. And he would do his patent office work in the morning, and then in the afternoon would think about physics. And it was during that time when he worked in the patent office that he wrote some of the most famous and groundbreaking papers that he was known for. And he called that patent office the worldly cloister where I hatched all my most beautiful ideas. Another example, one of my favorites, there's a guy named John Baker. This was a person who lived after the Second World War in the UK and England. He was a lover of literature who had no college degree. And he worked at an office job at something called the Automobile Association of Essex in England. So it's like the British equivalent of AAA, so about the most boring desk job you might be able to imagine. But in his spare time, he became fascinated with peregrine falcons. And he stalked over his home of Essex, his home region, for 10 years. On bicycle, mostly, or on foot. He carried maps and took voluminous notebooks. So just noted down everything that he saw about these birds, the peregrine falcons. And he ended up consolidating all of that experience, that 10 years of intensive bird watching, into a single sort of poetic masterpiece called Peregrine, which I was delighted to discover a few years ago. It's a wonderful book if you like literature, especially literature about nature. So the men and women who I've described pursued intellectual activity, reading, studying, thinking, observing, mathematics, bird watching, reflection on fundamental questions. They pursued that outside of universities with an intensity that you probably don't always find in yourself or in your own classes, like in a regular college or regular university. So there's a kind of intensity that these characters have that is not found in the conventional vehicles for this type of learning that we have. So the case of Malcolm X, if you remember, as he illustrates, intellectual life is not just a retreat or an escape from difficult realities. So one way you could think about these prisoner cases is, well, these peoples are living extremely difficult lives. What are they going to do? They've got to do something. So they escape into mathematics, or they escape into literature, or they escape into poetry, or to learning languages. But it's clear that it's more than that in the case of Malcolm X, because he's transformed. So the intellectual life is a source of transformation. And I think it's also worth bringing in a book some of you may have read or be reading for class, Augustine's Confessions, one of my favorites. So Augustine, if you think about the Confessions pretty early on, he has the perfect life. He has a promising career. He's about to make it big as a rhetoric teacher in Rome. He has a loving concubine. You know, he's been with the same woman for a long time. They live together. They have a child. You know, he's not sure what he thinks about that, so he has the prospect of a wealthy wife that will help to advance him even further in his career. He belongs to this cult, right? The Manichaeans, this who believe in the two basic forces of the world being good and evil. So the nice thing about belonging to a cult, not that I recommend it, I don't, but it has advantages because he has this cosmic worldview that absolves him of any responsibility for his life. So for Manichaeans, everything in the world is this huge battle between material forces of good and evil. It's going on regardless of what you do. So, you know, it's not really to be expected that you would have to make difficult choices that might change your life or transform your life. So that's why I say he has the perfect life. He has everything that he wants. It's totally comfortable. And he's very intelligent. So he gets in these arguments with regular Christians. He always wins. He always wins. He humiliates the people that he talks to because he's so good at speaking. He's so intelligent. He's so good at finding flaws. So he's a kind of a perfect, looks like, from one perspective. Like he's living the perfect life. He's living the dream. And he starts reading philosophy, and the whole thing starts to come into pieces. So he realizes that there are problems with the Manichaean worldview. There are conflicts between things that astronomers have noticed and things that are in the Manichaeans. He starts to realize that it might be something in this idea that there's more to just the material world. There's something beyond it. And so these chinks open up in his armor, and in the end, the whole thing gives way, right? And he has this beautiful conversion moment, and you know, sort of gives over his life, dedicates himself to being a philosopher, then a bishop, a man of the church. And he gives up sex, he gives up his prestigious career, he gives up everything else that he cares about, and he lives this life of philosophy in pursuit of wisdom. So that's to say that the love of wisdom for Augustine starts out as this little thing, this little seed in the midst of this kind of big, beautiful, compromised life. And it bores holes in it to the point where suddenly it becomes all that matters to him. And he loses everything in one way, and another way he gains everything. He gains what he cared about most, which was a life of wisdom. So the Christian parallel, apart from Augustine, to the studious prisoners who I mentioned, the people who study in prison, it takes its most famous form, and this is the first time this has happened. I've talked about this in a number of places. It's the first time that on the walls there's been an illustration. So look over here, okay? This painting is, it's Fra Angelico, I think, and it's the Annunciation. And you can see, okay, on the left-hand side, there's a parallel story of Adam and Eve leaving the garden. But the main part of the action is an angel coming to talk to Mary, the Holy Spirit descending on her through a beam of light. If you look closely, there may be something in the beam, depends on the painting. Sometimes there's like a little tiny baby holding a crucifix. It's really fascinating. Anyway, but there's one other thing that's in this picture. Look on Mary's lap. She's reading. If you look, go to an art museum or Google Annunciation painting and go through Google Images, and you'll see that there's literally dozens, maybe hundreds of paintings of this scene, and she always has a book, sometimes a lot of books. This is a little tiny book. It could pass for like a little prayer book. Sometimes she's in a study like piled with books. It's just, I discovered this some years ago, and I was just completely enchanted. I had never thought of the Virgin Mary as being a bookworm. But that's how she's portrayed in this late medieval and Renaissance art. She's portrayed as someone who's reading, and especially at this moment when the angel arrives. She's absorbed, and look at us, you can see other features of this painting. She's alone. She's inside, apart from the angel. She's inside, right? So she's kind of in a secluded, enclosed space. You get the sense she's just by herself in a room, quietly reading when the angel turns up. So it's sheltered, enclosed, in solitude. You imagine in silence. That seems to be the place where she's reading. So this is a tradition which turns out to date from the 2nd century, from so very early in the Church Fathers, that Mary was learned, was a bookworm. She was an avid reader, and it's often the Holy Scriptures that she's reading. It's often the Bible that she's reading. Sometimes it's the passage from Isaiah that predicts a virgin conceiving, and you can see in the book that it's written, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive." So what does it mean? Why did the painters or the fathers think this way? Well, the reading, I think, symbolizes her wisdom, the freedom, right? Her independence from, she's in this solitary place. There's nothing distracting her. She's not looking at what other people are doing. She's not a part of a social scene. She's not following an autopilot. She's by herself. So it symbolizes her independence and her freedom with which she responds to the angel when she says, "Be it done unto me according to thy word." So she gives her consent to bear the Messiah. So her enclosed or sheltered surroundings, I think they symbolize sort of the environment where wisdom is nurtured, which is in spaces that are a bit withdrawn, right? The bookworm in the corner. The prison cells are a dramatic example. I wouldn't choose those voluntarily, but they do have some effect, right? You're removed from social life. You're removed from social competition. You don't have a lot of stuff to distract you. That seems to be the kind of environment that nurtures study and the pursuit of wisdom. So the bookworms escape. The thoughtful prisoners, isolated bird watcher, think about John Baker on his bicycle. They evoke, I think, Catholic and Orthodox contemplative traditions. So if you read in your studies anything from the Church Fathers, you know that in the early church, people fled to the desert to pray and to think. They built pillars and lived on platforms on pillars in order to be withdrawn from the world, in order to focus most completely on God. So they have or if you think about the cell of a monk or a nun, right? Monks or nuns live in small rooms, solitary rooms, very simple. There's a beautiful picture. I wish I had slides. I mean, this is better than a slide because you can look at it every day. But I have a beautiful slide of Teresa of Avila's cell in Avila. It's so simple, white plaster walls, simple twin bed, a cross on the walls, nothing fancy. There's no if I start talking about stuff to play video games with, I'm just going to date myself. So I'm not going to try to talk about an Xbox, whatever. I'll just sound like an old person, which I am. But there's no video game equipment. There's no screens. There's no phones. There's no TV. There's not even a lot of books in Teresa of Avila's cell. It's very simple, empty, silent. So now there's a way in which this environment is one which is deprived. Okay, it's what we call in the Christian tradition ascetic. It's sacrificed. Okay, you sacrifice distraction, you sacrifice some comfort, you sacrifice some luxury in order to create space for something else. So these Christian versions of poverty and failure and confinement, they have a supernatural character, a character of something directed at God. So if you think about this painting, part of what you're seeing is the communion of this young woman with God, with the creator of the universe, and with the father of the Messiah. So there's this connection between the individual soul and the God that creates and redeems. But it's also true that forms of asceticism, forms of deliberately chosen sacrifice, poverty, etc., they're found in a huge range of religious traditions. So there's also Hindu monasticism, Buddhist monasticism, even forms of Jewish and Muslim monasticism, where even in these other faith traditions, you go and live someplace removed from the rest of the world. Or think about, for those of you who might be in Civ reading Plato, figure of Socrates. He's poor. Okay, he lives in a city, sure. So he doesn't live in a cell, but he's poor. He neglects his family, not recommended, but a kind of sacrifice. He's poor, he's barefoot. He's totally obsessed with the search for wisdom. He's totally preoccupied by it. He doesn't care about anything else, and he dies for it. Which is, when you think about it, the weirdest thing in the world. Okay, I could go on and on about that. So what is asceticism? What is this idea that one sacrifices comfort and convenience and social liveliness for the sake of something else? Well, I think it has a basis in human elements. It's not just a Christian thing. It's something human. It's the necessity of forms of discipline and sacrifice to bring out what's best in us. And that's because there's this corrosive impact of wealth, status, comfort, convenience on our motivations. So if you think about it, even athletics, I mean, I shouldn't say even, in a way it's the most obvious example, it involves all kinds of sacrifice and deprivation in order to cultivate certain kinds of excellence or ability. An athlete doesn't just roll out of bed an athlete. They have to eat special diets, they have to undertake debilitating routines, they have to endure injuries, they have to, I was hearing about the various sensory deprivation chambers and freezing rooms that people with injuries for the basketball team might go to. Okay, so there's this whole set of practices which are ascetical, which involve sacrifice, discipline, suffering, and focus. And that's what makes it possible for other kinds of excellence to develop. And I think the life of the mind and the life with God are very similar that way. They require a certain kind of discipline, but they're not as familiar to us as the disciplines of athletics or the disciplines of art. Very similar, right? You practice piano like every day, and then you get kind of good. And it takes something special, a special kind of discipline, special kind of focus, special kind of passion, maybe like athletics, a special kind of physical constitution to become a truly amazing, great piano player. But it's not going to happen without creating space for that to develop in you. Okay. So asceticism is just the forms of discipline and sacrifice that cultivate what's best in us. Very general way. And I don't just mean what's best in us, should be clear by now, I don't just mean intellectual excellence, like being good at math, being good at philosophy, being good at reading, being good at physics, writing great history papers. I mean the ability that we see in our earlier characters to recover one's dignity, one's sense of oneself in the face of the diminishments of ordinary life. And allows you to form connections or community on the basis of that dignity. So if you think about Malcolm X in his prison, he forms a friendship with this autodidact guy, the guy that taught himself everything, who's really interesting. They form a friendship that's different from friendships that you might have had on the outside, because it's on the basis of jointly recovering one's dignity, one's humanity, one's sense of who one is, in light of conditions which are deliberately dehumanizing, oppressive, belittling, and so on. And I think we all find ourselves one way or the other in circumstances like that. Social life, in many ways, competitive life, has winners and losers, and we find ourselves diminished. We need something in which to put our dignity, our security, our sense of who we are. Okay. I'm getting near the end, don't worry. Okay. And this kind of dignity, this kind of community, it's not reserved to people like Einstein or brilliant poets who get sent to Siberian prisons. It's not limited to the greatest saint of all times, the Virgin Mary. It's not limited to special people. It's something that any human being can find and get. And if you think to yourself about the people that you know, people in your family, people in your community growing up, people that you might know here, you can probably think of some people who are particularly good at maintaining their dignity in the face of something. It's worth thinking about these people and identifying them, because if you notice them, then you start to think about how they got that way, and it makes it a bit easier to find those things in oneself. Okay, let me take a drink of water and pause for a second. Give your ears a break. So I've described some people who live an intellectual life, a life of the mind. It's a life in which the love of learning, the love of poetry, the love of birds, the love of physics, whatever it is exercised for its own sake. And it's called, that kind of love of learning and its exercise is what's called, in this old-fashioned sense, liberal learning or liberal education. It includes, not exclusively, what we call the humanities. This is the humanities forum we're part of now. The study of human beings in literature, philosophy, political theory, history. But mathematics and science, I think should be obvious, can also be pursued for their own sake. And so my interest is more broad than just the humanities. So what makes the love of learning for its own sake different from the love of sports for its own sake, or the love of walking in the woods for its own sake, love of fly fishing for its own sake, making model ships out of toothpicks for its own sake? There's a museum down in Baltimore with art that was made by people who had certain kinds of mental challenges. And this person made an entire, like a huge replica of a famous historical ship, the Lusitania, out of toothpicks. It's absolutely astonishing. You have to go see it sometime. If you're ever in Baltimore, you should go look at it. Okay, so what makes the life of learning for its own sake different from doing these other kinds of things for their own sake? So like I said earlier, liberal learning, liberal education has nothing to do with liberalism, nothing to do with politics necessarily, definitely nothing to do with Democrats versus Republicans or free markets versus state-controlled economics or anything like that. It's a kind of learning that liberates, that cultivates a free person. So in what sense do the human beings that I've described display freedom? Most of them are prisoners, so that's kind of weird to think of them as displaying freedom. They all have highly restricted choices, including our beautiful friend over here on the wall, quite restricted set of choices. So it's a strange kind of freedom that a prisoner can keep, or even a prisoner might have special access to. So what kind of thing is counting as unfreedom? What kind of slavery are we thinking about if we think of these people as free? So let's go back to thinking about what I asked you about at the beginning of the talk about why we might study in our everyday college culture. And I teach at a college, it's in many ways the same way. So think about this force called autopilot. You go to college, you go to grad school, you do this stuff because everyone you know is doing it. It's just what's expected. You just do, you put one foot in front of the other, you do what you're told, you do what's expected. You choose from the options that are on the menu, so to speak. You don't do anything crazy. You belong to a social group, a social class. and you do what they do. And that's not a bad thing in itself. That's the way human beings work. But it has to be looked at with some care. It has to be noticed, I think, because it can diminish the whole of one's life if that's all that we do is go on autopilot. So education, going to college, is necessary for most forms of work that bring in money, comfortable lifestyle, or social status. Now, sometimes that's taken up honestly. We know that we're going to college to get a good job. And sometimes it hides behind other kinds of ways of thinking about oneself. Sometimes I think we find, I don't want to dwell on this because it's probably less familiar to you guys who are newer in your academic journey. But if you spend a long time in academia, you get to know certain kinds of projects which actually just sound like empty words. So I wrote down a while ago, this was something that had been in the news that isn't anymore. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but there was a major research organization that included projects like converting the patterns of nature and the human body into beneficial signals and energy, advancing justice in Earth's complex systems using designs enabled by space. Okay, so you hear those words and you try to think about what they might mean, and you can. And maybe you can't because they're actually, it's jargon. It's words that are being tossed around without meaning. So what's happening here? Like, where do these things come from? And it's some kind of slurry, some kind of mix of like money and prestige and stuff that people like to hear. It's the language of the media splash or like the public relations coup. It sounds good to wealthy people or to powerful people, and so it exists. And so more common in terms of the way that the autopilot can go wrong is the growth of, there's a sociologist named David Graeber, published a book a few years ago. And this is a family college, so Catholic college, so the BS jobs. And this guy Graeber wrote a short internet essay about BS jobs and then got hundreds of letters from all over the world that gave him like amazing examples. So the book is kind of worth looking at just to look at what these real people did for money. So for example, so a BS job it's work that involves pretending to do something important, where in fact there's no tangible good that's produced. You actually have no idea what the meaning of this work is, even though you're highly paid and even though it has a good job title. So for instance, there's a guy in the book who's a subcontractor to a subcontractor to the German military, and his job is to drive long distances to move furniture from one room to another, and to make sure that all the paperwork's in order for the moving of the furniture. There's an incredible story, probably the best story in the book. A man who's hired there's a problem in a company, and the two people in charge disagree about whether to fix it or how. So one of them wants to fix it and the other one doesn't. So what they do is they hire someone with the official title of fixing it, but he's not supposed to fix it. Okay? So this is real life. This kind of thing happens in the real world. So he's hired to patch a problem that actually the higher authorities don't want fixed. So he's paid to literally do absolutely nothing. It's a fancy job title, a big salary, paid to do nothing. So he starts out reading novels at work, and then he starts drinking at work, and then he starts taking phony work trips. He's trying to get himself fired, in fact, and he can't do it. So he actually tries to resign at one point. He can't stand it. I mean, it's interesting to think about why, right? You might think a job with lots of money, high prestige, and no work is the dream. But it actually kind of eats him up inside. He doesn't like doing it. So he tries to quit, and they give him a raise. I think he finally, he has to flee in the dead of night. He leaves a resignation letter and just leaves without any notice in the end. Thank God. Okay, so What's fascinating about these stories is, again, how deeply unhappy these workers are. They have money and status without having to work for it. So, so these are examples, I think, of the kind of unfreedom that liberal learning seeks to counter. So if you're working in these contexts, you're doing research that entertains media figures or wealthy donors, or that creates an appearance of productivity, your work is really for other people's ends. It doesn't do anything for you. You're not just a cog in a machine, which in a way is kind of a good thing. So if you work at the factory, making a particular kind of part that makes a car run, you're at least doing something which produces something at the end of the chain of which something good happens. But in this case, there's no product. There's no human good that's ever met. So it's a way that you're being used basically to create an appearance that makes someone money. And it's very diminishing, I think, to a human being to work in this way. It's a real attack on one's dignity as a person. And it's much more dignified, even though it's actually you make a lot less money and you don't have the kind of prestige to do work that serves a much more evident need. Now, for some reason in our community, the work that serves the most obvious need is the lowest prestige. So like, what's more important than a garbage collector? Nothing. Incredibly important, garbage collectors. People who clean bathrooms, very, very important. And you know that if you've ever been in a really, really nasty bathroom or been in a place where there's garbage that's not collected. What would we do without home health aides? They're very, very important if you know an aging person. So the greater the human need, the more important it is. For some reason, it's lower ranked in our community. But I think in some ways you're better off in terms of your dignity in working in these kinds of environments. And despite how important this kind of work is, even this kind of task isn't really sufficient for a full human life. Okay, you're serving your community, you're helping your neighbor, you're helping things run, but you run the risk of not being a full member of your community. So you're someone who's kind of down the totem pole, and that's especially true in communities where there's a lot of social inequality. So think about the home health aide who can't afford health care. Okay? That's someone who's doing work that helps others to which he or she has no benefit. They're not full members of the community. Okay. So the truth is that we are exposed to different professions and professional training without reference to the ultimate good that they serve. Am I building an apartment complex for people to live in? Or am I building an investment complex that's going to make investors money? But it's going to be left as, it's going to make someone some money, but it's going to be left as an empty eyesore once the money has been made. One form of building serves the common good, the other doesn't. Is the healthcare I'm learning practiced on healing the sick, improving the lives of others, providing comfort to the elderly, or is it a form of cosmetics or eugenics for the rich to distinguish themselves? This is the kinds of ways that the life that you end up leading, the life that you're preparing for as a college student, have a real impact on your eventual dignity, your sense of being a human person. So I really am almost done. This is the last page of the talk. So I'm going to pull things back together. So liberal learning of liberal education of the kind I'm concerned with was conceived and developed, including the one that underlies your Civ program, as well as the Great Books program where I teach at St. John's in Annapolis. It was developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was developed when a large class of laborers and immigrants sought to improve their lives by appropriating themselves the education of aristocrats. So in the old days, only aristocrats were educated, only aristocrats were literate, and they read classics. So part of the movement of the late 19th century, early 20th century, is to take that education and bring it out to everyone through translations, through mass-marketed books, and so on. And the Great Books programs came from the self-organizing of working people through labor unions, et cetera, and people who wanted to educate themselves to better their lives and to bring their lives out of the kind of diminishments of factory labor, other kinds of lower class, working class labor, where all you're doing is working. You're doing something good for the community, but you're treated very badly. You're paid very poorly, and your body is not respected as something which, whose health and well-being matters. Okay, so these people, laborers and immigrants, they sought to improve their lives by appropriating the learning of the aristocrats through great books and classics. And they're aided by the mass market paperback printing technology and a vast industry of translating classics into English. So that meant that books that were reserved for centuries for only a few people suddenly become accessible to anyone who could read. So working men and women in the UK and the US, these are the places that have been best documented that I know about, they formed clubs and groups, formal and informal, to read, to educate themselves, and to think about fundamental questions of human life. They sought citizenship, political rights, as well as economic freedom, but they also sought learning for its own sake. They sought thinking and reflection to escape from the diminishments of factory work and other kinds of servile labor. So liberal learning relies on the principle that I am most free when I exist in some way for my own sake. My humanity is respected. I am most free when I choose the ends for which I work. I choose to produce a good for my community. I'm not just following a trail of breadcrumbs to a destiny that I don't know. I've thought about the end that I'm acting for, and I choose it. That is the freedom, I think, or some piece of it, that liberal education seeks to cultivate. So I just want to end with a question, and then I'll open it up to you guys. I'm sure you guys have questions. Why is it this type of freedom, the freedom to live life for one's own sake, to pursue a meaningful life, to consider the value of one's own ends, why is it something difficult? Why does it require something ascetical? Why does it require sacrifice, solitude, focus, discipline? Why is it rare, such that one achieves it, maybe you get it only when you're sent to prison or after a catastrophic failure to get a job? Why does failure and suffering seem to generate it? And I'll just make a suggestion that I think instrumental tasks, autopilot tasks, they have a kind of enchanting effect. They can be exercised with a certain amount of ingenuity and energy. They seem valuable in themselves in the moment sometimes. And if they're lavished with money and prestige, they're even harder to see as what they are. So we can convince ourselves that they're the best thing that there is. I think the basic danger that faces not just young people but also older people is we can use ourselves as vehicles of wealth and prestige, but we're diminishing the fullness of our human person, and we're also innocently serving the selfish ends of others, or the destructive ends of others. And I think that this is the form of unfreedom that a liberal education, the kind of education that you're offered here, is meant to free you from. Okay. Those are my remarks. Thank you so much. So I went over time, so I'm happy to go over time for questions if we like.
All right, we got one over here.
Thank you so much for sharing your talk with us today. I wanted to bring up the first question you asked us again. I myself have struggled with it a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people here have. And I think the problem is that a lot of us just don't really know what it is we want and are probably too anxious to think about it. Often our minds are exactly the places we don't want to be in just because the pressure's on us. And, it seems safe to say that you're suggesting we ought to secure ourselves in the life of the mind to liberate ourselves in community and alone. but I think that can only happen if we want it. So what do we do when we don't know what we love? And what are the first steps to disenchantment?
That's a great question. Do you want to just take the rest of it? That's a great question, and I don't know that I have an answer that's going to be satisfying. So one of the reasons why I travel around giving talks is, your teachers are very likely trying to present you with various materials, various readings that are trying to awaken these thoughts in you, these kinds of desires in you. In the end, though, it is a realm of human freedom to some extent. So that's part of it, but it's even more complicated than that, because I think that most of human development, human maturing, it's like the maturing of anything. It's a natural process, and it's not the same for everybody. So if you've spent any time in a garden or growing plants, like that one plant flourishes, another plant takes a longer time to flourish, and you don't know why. You're doing your best. So that's more the perspective of the teacher, because when sometimes I see people really get excited about and really trying to think about what's good, and then there are other people that are just like, when's class over? Now give me my B+. And so I don't always know what makes the difference. So there's something that's distinctive in each individual's experience, and there are processes that are going on all the time that are invisible both on the inside and on the outside. And so I don't think there's a clear answer to this question, but I do think that if you are moved to really think about what kinds of goods you want to live for, I think if you talk about that to your friends, or to people that aren't your friends, either way, in whatever way that seems appropriate. I'm not saying you have to get up and give speeches. Just be that person. I think you'll help them. You'll help people that have not yet gotten there. So that's, I think, how most of us develop. We develop through what we see our friends, our family, our people in our community doing. So yeah, and you hope for the best. You're patient. Not a lot more to say about that than that. Sorry. I wish I could. I wish I had a magic trick, but I don't have one. You have a question? Oh, okay.
I do.
So shy. Okay, please.
I was just thinking about what you were saying earlier about with like the buildings, like one of the like you were connecting them like about if like one's truly good.
Yeah.
Like when they're thinking about motives, like do motives matter that much if it's still good? Like if you're like, okay, I'm still gonna like have a building, but also the building, it can be both good and bad. Like, does that matter that much if it's both good and bad?
Okay, that's a great question. I'll spell it out. I think I'll spell it out, and then you can tell me if I've gotten it wrong. I think I've understood your question. So the way I put it was, so you imagine you're an architect or a carpenter, a contractor, and there's a building that you're building for someone to live in, or some people to live in. And there's a building that you're building as a kind of real estate speculative scheme where, like, they get a bunch of investment money, they try to get the investment money out with a profit before the whole thing collapses. You're left with this kind of eyesore that never produces any good for anyone. So that contrast case, the distinction's just in what happens to the buildings and in the way that the people who undertake them are planning and thinking about what they're doing. Now, how do you tell from the outside which is which? Not always easy. And you don't always know. So there's a certain kind of discernment and experience that goes along with trying to figure out what kinds of projects are worthwhile and which aren't, who's serving the public good and who isn't. So that's a kind of an attempt to make a really clear-cut case. There might really be a difference in the types of houses that you build. Now, I think your question is really about what happens when your motives are mixed. So like all I care about is being like the most famous, wealthy architect in the world. I build buildings that people live in, but like I'm only doing it for the power and the fame and the prestige.
But what if you love making those amazing buildings and like the beauty of it, and that it's helping?
Well, exactly. So, and you could have both, right? So, I think in the end, we have to examine our own motivations. It's very important, especially if we're believers. Like you have to try to do things for the right reasons. But our motives are usually mixed, and so one of the ways of keeping one's life in order is trying to discern. I think it's the virtue of prudence, honestly. It's trying to discern what projects are actually good. Like, what's the common good here? Is it serving my neighbor in a concrete, visible way? And that, even if your motivations are mixed, at least you're tying it down to something which is worth doing. Whereas in the other case, even if your motivations are good, you really believe that this building you're building might help someone, and you're kind of shocked to see it turn into a shell. It's still, that's a harder way of, it's easy to get to lose track of oneself in that kind of circumstance. Anyway, I hope that helps.
Yeah, it did.
So I have a sort of a thought to throw toward you to see if how you might explain ways of harnessing some of these ideas that you have. So and really make greater use or harness the benefit of a liberal education. What I mean by that is the old idea of a Dominican idea, contemplare, contemplata, alis tradere. Henry Nouwen might have said that solitude is the furnace of transformation. You mentioned very interestingly get this from the aristocrats, and then what you said happened after that is the essence of innovation that happens day in and day out in business all over the place the last 100 years, which is making things easier, more convenient, more accessible, more possible, more affordable for a greater number of people. So what I look at doing is how do you leverage that, the old idea, I think Pope Benedict talks about it too. How do you cultivate a heart that sees with empathy and compassion where love is needed or greater good is needed, and then harness the collective efforts of people to coordinate their actions to deliver such a thing. So what I'm saying is I think that business and liberal arts, or true business that you can do well by doing good, and the liberal arts education are far more mutually reinforcing than they are contradictory. But I think there's a stereotype out in the world that that's not so. So how do you harness this strength? Because there's something very, very true about it. I think there's greater truth in this than the false ideas and the greed and the wealth and all those things lead towards slavery and not freedom.
Right, so I think that the reason why there's a difficulty, and the reason why, if in case, for those of you who are less familiar with these things, we often think about liberal arts and making money, business, as being completely separate, even enemies of one another. And I think I often talk this way myself. And I think in this talk maybe more than others, I am actually really trying to point towards a way in which these things work together, right? So a life of a person with an inner life that's well cultivated, a person that has this kind of sense of their own dignity and their own independence, their freedom of operating in the world, that person is able to see, one hopes, with practice, with development, with good models, with good luck, with the grace of God, one learns to see what's actually good for the community. But I think the reason why there is a stereotype that there's a lot of what I'd call bad faith or dishonest compromises one makes. So you can say because it is possible to have a liberal education and then use it for the common good in a way that is actually lucrative for you and helps others, okay, that's a strict possibility, then it's very tempting, it's very automatic, it's very easy because of this force called autopilot, I'm calling autopilot. It's very easy just to be enchanted by, okay, well, you reverse it. You think, oh, well, that means that if it makes money and if it has this kind of high prestige and if there's success connected to it, that means I'll be able to fit in my liberal education in with it. And I think our world doesn't work that way. So I think especially right now, it's really important to develop one's own judgment about what's good. It's not enough just to follow along with the general flow of commerce. Because you can end up doing a lot of, I think, really terrible things. So that's why I often talk as if there's this deep hostility between, making money and pursuing status or pursuing the life of the mind. The reason why I talk that way is because if you don't know that the pursuit of money and status can go wrong, then you're in bad shape. It's better for you to just give up thinking about those things for a time, maybe just the length of time it takes to do your civ class, or maybe to do a liberal arts major, but for a time, you're like, I'm not going to think about those things. You focus on something else, you withdraw from the world, and then you come back, you look at things with fresh eyes. Because it's so easy to just get pulled along into what's automatic, and I think it's not a good way. It's not good for the individuals, and it's not good for the public. Yeah, go ahead. Well, I think it's part of human nature. Autopilot is just kind of the way we are. But I think that maybe if I can be more concrete, the way things are right now is there's a small number of very powerful people and very powerful companies that set the agenda for everything, every aspect of life, education, sports, blah, 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 whatever you name it. And to follow the autopilot is more likely to get you embroiled in something, I think, right now than it was maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago in our lifetimes. It probably was always dangerous. It was probably never a good idea to just rely on your autopilot. But I think right now it's especially dangerous because there's so few people generating the tracks that we move on. And it's not for our interest that they're doing it, it's for their interest. So it's very, very easy to get caught up in practices that are really just for someone else's good and that aren't serving the public good. And I think most of us who are older, now I'm speaking to my fellow older people, it's easy for us who are older to see that institutions that once functioned are not functioning the way they used to. They're not connecting to the human goods in the way they used to. And so that's one of the reasons why I think this topic has a kind of urgency to it, and why, for a time, forget about wealth and status. Not because they're intrinsically evil or because they're going to they're definitely going to mess up your life, but because if you don't set them aside for a time, you'll never see clearly when things can fit together, and you won't be able to see as clearly your own motivations. Yes.
Hello, Dr. Hitz. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks for being here.
I wanted to ask something that's in your book and also in your talk today. You talk a lot about how the love of learning requires a form of asceticism or solitude and self-isolation and separation from the social scene. I would question if that's necessarily exclusive to the love of learning, because in my life, I've had all sorts of conversations with people and close friends that I've discovered things about myself I would have never discovered without that collaboration and that social connection. And in the first question you answered, you also talked about how development of oneself requires that kind of conversation with friends, family, and that's how we develop as human beings. So I would, while reading and while listening to your talk, that point keeps coming up in my head, and I would like to question, is that necessarily the only way of loving learning for its own sake?
Right. So to me, it feels very close to the previous question in a certain way. Okay, so the role of solitude is very similar to the role of separation from other concerns, and it's in fact a vehicle for that. So the reason why some kind of social withdrawal is needed 99% of the time is because our social life is naturally competitive. If you think about some people are really lucky. Sometimes I talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, in my middle school, everyone liked each other and helped each other, and we all worked things out. And I'm like, what planet do these people live on? That was not my middle school. It was like every person for themselves. It was a war of all against all. So, you need to get away from thinking of your social standing, your position relative to other people in the room, whether you're the smartest, whether you're the second smartest, whether you're the third smartest, whether you're like the defiant, cool person who's like, I don't care about intelligence, I'm good at other stuff, So solitude is necessary to build that kind of inner strength. Withdrawal is for the sake of engagement in the way that I'm thinking about it. So in the end, you want to connect with other people. You want to be a part of community, and you're absolutely right. That's where most learning takes place, is with other people. But you need some kind of withdrawal first. I mean, one analogy here, I'm talking about intellectual life, life of the mind, but there's a pretty clear analogy with spiritual life for those of you who have some experience with that. So you go on a retreat, right? You go and pray for a while in solitude or in silence, or you go to Mass and you focus on the Mass for an hour a week. You're pulling away from other things, not because that's somehow what you should be doing all the time, but because that's the source where you get what you need to function in the rest of your life. So silence, solitude, and withdrawal from wealth prestige, it's part of the same kind of thing. It's a form of discipline, a form of practice that permits you to do better when you return to the world and engage with others and serve your community. But without it, you're really in danger of not seeing yourself clearly. I'll give one example, and then I'll move on to another question. So the first time I went on a silent retreat, I don't know, how many people here have been on a totally silent retreat? Probably not too many. A few, okay. First time I went on a silent retreat, I thought it was going to be so peaceful. I was like, oh, finally, I'll get away from everything. I'll just go on this silent retreat, and I'll just totally peace out. It'll be amazing. It'll just be me and God. So I go on this silent retreat, and it's absolutely exhausting because all of my anxious thoughts have nothing to exercise themselves on, and I have no way to distract myself. So it's torture, because it turned out all that anxiety and all that busyness was inside my own head. Now, I don't know that until I go to a place where I can't talk for a day or 8 days or whatever it was. So that's the kind of exercise, the kind of self-knowledge that asceticism can get you. It can help you to see what's really going on, who you really are, and to cultivate parts of yourself that you can use in other contexts.
Thank you, Dr. Hitz, both for the intellectual life, the book, and which I loved, and for the talk this afternoon. This is a question I'm working now on trying to sort this out for myself, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it. So this is, I guess, the best way I could come up with on the fly to put the question. What's the relationship between liberal education and worship? So just as I've been thinking about these things for myself, I have in mind, I think, kind of two textual nodes. One of them is David Foster Wallace's 2005 address at Kenyon College, where he talks about the default settings. I think that's his version of your autopilot.
I probably got it from him, actually.
And in that talk, he talks about, he kind of ends with the idea that you have to, he urges the graduating class, choose something to worship. Because if you don't choose it, it'll eat you, he says. He says, I don't care what it is. It can be Jesus, it can be Adonai, it can be Wiccan, Mother Earth, Witch, Goddess, like whatever it is, but choose it, like whatever it is. And that's kind of one point that I've been thinking about. So the object doesn't seem to matter, like as long as you're aware that there is some kind of relationship. Then the other kind of thing that I've been thinking about along these lines is John Henry Newman's claim that liberal education doesn't have anything to do with making saints. It has to do with cultivating the intellect, right? The liberal education produces a gentleman, or lady, I guess. It doesn't make a saint. That's not the role of it. And I've been trying to kind of coordinate these things, and I would love your perspective. You can abandon the text if you want, but the real question is about worship.
That's a wonderful question. I can take a hack at it. I don't know how adequate it will be.
Hack away.
I think, so let's start with Newman. I don't think I would put it quite the way that you put it. And I don't know Newman well, so I'm not reporting on Newman, but I'm reporting on your account of it. So I don't think it's true. I don't think it's quite true that liberal education is not making saints. What it is something like a preparation of the natural basis of sanctity. It's a human. I think of liberal education as being a human good. It's not. It's a natural good. It's not essentially supernatural. It happens at the natural level. And I say this in part because I teach at a secular school. I teach people from all walks of life, and there's some kind of liberation that happens to all of them, or to most of them, regardless of where they come from. And that's not to say they all become Christians, they all become Catholics. They don't. Some of them do. It's always nice to see. But I did. That was part of the effect of my liberal education. But it's not, it's like, I think it's pointed in a particular direction. So I also think that maybe Wallace is wrong too. It's, you can't worship anything, okay? Does he mention Mammon, the god of wealth, like the golden calf? He may not, right? And there's a reason why he doesn't, which is because that's the thing that most people worship. So that's the default setting for worship, is the worship of wealth, or the worship of power, the worship of status. So you want to be pointed in a direction. And again, this is part of what I think is so beautiful about, however providentially it happened, that we began our liberal arts education usually with Plato and Socrates, because Socrates is this figure. He's totally dedicated to what? To wisdom, to the best life. He sacrifices everything he has for it. Now, is he Catholic? No. Is he Christian? No. What does he worship? I don't know. He calls it God. What does he mean? Couldn't tell you. It could be something very bloodless and intellectual and not particularly Christian. But it's in that direction, it seems to me. It's in the direction of Christianity, and that's part of what I think the church has taught, right, is that philosophy and the search for wisdom are, the natural movements which are graced by other things. And that, to be clear, just because, I think you know this, but because I'm talking to a wider audience, that doesn't mean that they're the only way to become saints, right? So you can be a saint without being liberally educated. That's part of our tradition too. You can be, why am I not remembering that wonderful saint's name? The Lourdes saint. No, the one who sees Our Lady at Lourdes. Bernadette. Thank you. Sorry, I don't know what's happened. It's dementia. Okay. So Saint Bernadette, who's this, illiterate peasant girl, she's a saint. She didn't need a liberal education. So it's not that it's necessary for everybody for sanctity, but it is for most of us, especially in our literate society. For most of us, it's some kind of very, very valuable prerequisite. It would be very foolish to set it aside if you had the opportunity for it, because it really does have the effect of uncovering one's core as a human being and exposing oneself to habits of reflection that can help us to see what's really good for us and for others. That's my thought. Thank you for the question.
There's still a number of hands up, but I think we're probably, in terms of time, we should probably just do one more. And then those of you who I've seen and acknowledged and I'm not going to get to, maybe we can just continue the conversation when we head next door. Here, go ahead.
Thank you. My question was, I'm going to try to put it bluntly. What's the difference between using your education to make a real choice and then instead of and using versus using the education to rationalize a choice that you feel is lined up for you? In other words, justifying the autopilot.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And that I think that you put your finger on exactly why what I'm talking about is so challenging. So what I'm really setting out for you is a challenge. And the mind can easily be used to just, to rationalize something that's already going on rather than to really be tell you what the good is that's guiding you. So I think honestly, philosophers or people who are accustomed to reflection, your teachers most likely. It's also true that I think within the church there's teachings that help. So one of the signs of self-deception, of rationalization, is that everything's too good. So if I describe Augustine's life, right, it's perfect. Everything's great, perfect. Everything lines up. Like, the real good doesn't tend to work that way. The real good tends to involve some kind of sacrifice. That doesn't mean it's all pain and misery and suffering, and so you should always choose the most miserable, painful, suffering option. No, but there's got to be something that you really want that's going to cost you something. And that's part of the structure of it. It's not enough because, of course, I really want to be CEO of this company. It's going to cost me my family, but it's worth it. Okay, no, that can't be right. But it's so you learn certain guidelines, certain moral principles that can't be violated, certain things that can't be done for the sake of something else, and then you look for the thing that seems really good, but that probably is going to cost you something. And those are the kind of the signs. And you talk to people, you talk to your friends, people you trust. And to try to figure out, to discern, this is the whole art of discernment, is figuring out what's rationalizing and what is a real perception of some good that you're pursuing. But it's very challenging. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of humility and a lot of seeking help. But recognizing the problem is crucial, absolutely crucial. Because you can sound very intelligent, very learned, even very holy, and in fact, you're just making up a rationalization for something that's selfish.
Thank you.
Let's all give a warm round of applause for Professor Hitz. And then, like I said, next door if you want to continue the conversation over refreshments.